Let me ask you a question. How do you eat an elephant? The answer is one mouthful at a time. It's not a literal question, of course. I'm not suggesting anyone should actually try and eat an elephant. I haven't seen what's on the lunch menu. I don't even know if elephants are edible. I raise it because it's a useful metaphor for how it's possible to go about tackling a challenge that is very, very large. The sort of challenge in size and scope that security has become for the shipping industry. 16 years ago, we were told that there was a substantial terrorist threat to shipping. And if there's one thing we know about terrorism, it's an instinctively scary subject. So it ranks up there in the list of things that worry us privately. Of course it does. Acts of terror damage, shock, enrage, bewilder, offend and frighten us, profoundly and overwhelmingly. That is what defines them. They influence our attitudes and change our behaviours. That is the purpose of terrorism. However, acts of terrorism outside of war and conflict zones are rare. To put it into perspective, according to US government statistics, there were just over 28,000 deaths attributed to terrorism in 2015. When you dig deeper, you discover that 69% of these were in 5 countries: Iraq, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Syria, and Yemen. In contrast, according to the World Health Organization, in 2015, 1.3 million people died as a result of road injuries, while 15 million were killed by heart disease and stroke. In reality, then, we worry disproportionately about terrorism relative to things that are more likely to kill us. In terms of security threats to shipping and ports globally, we have a heightened concern about terrorism also. Indeed, since 9/11, the working assumption has been that terrorism poses a significant threat to merchant ships and ports. If it wasn't so, how did we end up with the ISPS code, which after SOLAS and Open 90 is the most expensive piece of industry-wide regulation in the history of shipping? It's a good question because the visible evidence paints a different picture. Since 2001, there have been just 5 attacks against merchant ships. In 2002, there was the attack on the Limburg, in which 1 person lost their life. In 2004, the super ferry was attacked off the Philippines, killing 116 people, and it is the deadliest terrorist attack at sea to date. In 2005, there was an attack on a passenger vessel called Don Ramon, also in Filipino waters. In 2010, the tanker M-Star was attacked in the Straits of Hormuz, and more recently, but still 7 years ago, in 2013, the COSCO Asia was hit by a rocket-propelled grenade while it was transiting the Suez Canal. Over the same period, there has, by my count, been 2 terrorist attacks against civilians in ports. In 2004, 2 suicide bombers gained access to the port of Ashdod. One got into an office inside the port and detonated his bomb. The other blew himself up at the entrance to the port. 10 people were killed, 16 others were injured. And in December last year, Al-Shabaab claimed a suicide car bomb attack at the entrance to Mogadishu port, which killed 16 people and injured a further 48. Contrary then to perception, there have been few terrorist attacks against merchant ships or commercial ports. But why? Some people might argue that it's because the industry has successfully implemented the ISPS code. My view on that is that we don't know what would have happened had we not had the code. We can't say what the counterfactual narrative would have been. We do know that the code has not been implemented to a high standard at sea or in ports with anything approaching uniformity around the world. And it does not appear to have manifestly contributed to a reduction in security risks such as corruption, piracy, stowaways, cargo crime, people trafficking, and contraband smuggling, which affect many ships and ports every day. The ISPS code was developed with the best of intentions, and it has put security on the regulatory agenda. But whether it has helped deliver meaningful security improvements, both in ports and at sea, is very much open to question. I think there are two more likely reasons why terrorists haven't been targeting ships and ports with any greater frequency or success. Firstly, like most other organisations, terrorist groups focus their efforts on what works. The attacks on the Limburg, M-Star and Costco Asia resulted in the death of one person. One death is a terrible thing in itself, but none of those attacks resulted in a defining, headline-grabbing outcome. Indeed, I would bet few in the general public have ever heard of these casualties. Ironically, the lesson that shipping took at the time from the attack on the Limburg was that it was proof positive of the terrorist threat to shipping. Contrast that, however, with the Nice attack in July last year, when 86 people were killed and more than 400 injured, with no weapons, just a 19-ton truck, and one man's intent to keep driving into the assembled crowds until he was stopped. The fact is that terrorists achieve much more public outrage with far less complexity elsewhere and by other means ashore. Reason number two is that the shipping industry is the logistics network of terrorists and other criminals as much as it is of legitimate global business. Terrorists and criminals accomplish more by exploiting the supply chain than attacking it. By way of an example, back in 2002, 3 general cargo vessels were intercepted in Italian waters, having been suspected of conveying cells of terrorists from North African countries to certain Mediterranean ports for the purpose of inserting them into Europe illicitly. From one ship, the Sara, 15 Pakistanis were arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit acts of terrorism, the authorities having found documents on the men linking them to Al-Qaeda. It is instructive, perhaps, that that analysis of terrorist activity in the global maritime domain has, over the last 16 years, become as focused, if not more focused, on understanding how terrorists make use of international shipping and the supply chain, than strictly on the threat of them attacking it. Why, then, is there such an emphasis on the terrorist threat to shipping and ports? There is a very long, detailed, and complex answer to that, but I think a significant part of it boils down to this. Clearly, terrorism is an apex issue. The media and politicians highlight this constantly, and policymakers respond accordingly. But the corollary of this is that we have a lopsided view of the threat that global terrorism represents, giving it more weight than it merits relative to other more common and regular threats that materially damage the industry and harm the people working at the heart of it. It's a very human response to exaggerate rare and spectacular risks, as it is also to downplay regular and common ones. And we carry our anxieties and complacencies into our occupational lives too. We also confuse threats with vulnerabilities and risks, and we get confused about threat, vulnerability, and risk. We can all envisage what a terrorist attack on a port or a terminal or a ship might look like, probably because we have seen a scenario in a film or read it in a novel or even a research paper. But we do so with a tendency to underestimate how difficult it would be, in reality, to conceive, plan, organise and execute such an attack successfully. Therefore, we place an emphasis on terrorism not because we have a clear and informed view of the threat that it represents or our vulnerability to it, but rather because we don't. And there is a fundamental problem in this. At the same time that we are potentially over-responding to terrorism risks, we are downplaying or under-responding to regular and common security issues. Corruption, piracy, stowaways, cargo crime, contraband smuggling, people trafficking. We know that maritime crime exposes our seafarers personally to theft, emotional trauma, and increasingly to physical violence. Since January 2013, CSO Alliance has recorded 1,754 incidents of maritime crime in which 1,031 ships were successfully boarded, affecting an estimated 20,000 seafarers. We know too that these security issues hurt the industry. The cost of stowaway incidents each year is estimated to be in the region of $15 million. In 2013, the World Bank estimated the global economic cost of piracy off the coast of Somalia at $18 billion. Through attrition, if not always immediate impact, maritime crime damages the reputation of shipping companies and ports alike. It is critically important, therefore, that we make regular and common security issues central to our security priorities. And that matters because, in tackling the vulnerabilities which criminals are exploiting so routinely and effectively, we would be tackling the vulnerabilities that terrorists could exploit as well. We need to rethink our approach to maritime security. And no doubt that sounds like a mammoth-sized challenge, but it's okay. We know how to eat an elephant, don't we?